First book was Galactic Patrol. I am giving this... if you would ask me when I read it, I would say F. I'll give it a D. It's a proto-space opera, very influential, really dated. It's not as dreary as some longer, more bloated ones that followed it. Weeping May Tarry, also D. It's religious SF. First half is okay, second half is god-awful. Journey to the Center of the Earth is an A. I was very charmed by this. More of a travel story, adventure story than the book that I thought I was going to read. Great characters. It ages quite well. Peace War by Werner Vinge is a B, solid B, techno thriller. Great ideas. It's Vinge. Some of it's a little clunky, but it's good. It's also better than Marooned in Real Time, which I'm not going to give a C. I think that's also solid B tier. It's more of a time travel thing in the far future. Interesting ideas. Just not quite as good as Peace War. Eon by Greg Bear, definitely solid B. Top half of it is a great like James Cameron movie, and then it gets lost in its own sauce. Palace of Eternity, Bob Shaw, is the first S tier. It's a slim little space opera that goes to some crazy ass places. I still remember it. I still have it in my mind as a benchmark of like what space opera should be like. That and Fire Upon the Deep. Isle of the Dead by Zelazny is C tier. Zelazny gets lost up his own ass on some level with all the mythology stuff that might irritate, that will guaranteed irritate some Zelazny fans. It wasn't for me. Ancient My Enemy by Gordon R. Dixon, definitely C tier. The first and last stories are great. The rest of it is filler, and Dixon is very like 1950s suburb conservative, which gets on my nerves. Highway of Eternity by Simak, also solid C tier. I think this was his final novel. Really forgettable. It feels like some scraps from City, but not as good. Roadside Picnic, we all know if we watch the channel, is an S tier. Just an amazing book. It's my favorite science fiction book, possibly my favorite book, period, of all time. Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, I'll give a B. It's too meandering and was written, you can tell, as part of a series, so it just doesn't fully stand on its own legs so much, but there's some great atmosphere and horror moments in it. High Rise by Ballard is definitely A tier. I'm tempted to bump it up to S tier, but amazing, like, social horror novel. Rialto the Marvelous is B. It's the final Dying Earth book. It's the worst Dying Earth book. It's the only one that's forgettable. Pandora's Star is, yeah. There's one great chapter. Downward to the Earth by Silverberg is S tier, amazing book. It's a science fiction treatment of Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. It's about the legacy of colonialism and kind of a first contact novel in some sense. Canticle for Leibowitz is not as good as everybody insists that it is to me. I thought it was fine. It gets really dull in the middle, and it'll be great if you are a believer, if you're a religious person, if you're a Christian. I think that it would probably be more enjoyable because the religious content is pretty on the nose towards the end. Martian Chronicles by Bradbury is A tier. There's something that holds me back from being a full-blown Bradbury fan, and I can't put my finger on what it is, but Martian Chronicles is excellent. It is a lot more cynical than I thought it would be. I approve. Passmaster by Lafferty is A tier. It is a zany-ass book. It is hardcore right-wing, and if you can't find Star of the Unborn, then read Passmaster. It's kind of the same book. Voyager and Night by Cherry is C tier. I thought it would be more alien horror, body horror, but it's a book. It's like a coming-of-age story, sort of. Some teenagers lost on, or like people in their early 20s lost on an alien ship, and there are holograms of them. I don't know, whatever. King of Elfland's Daughter is amazing. This goes up to S tier. This might be my favorite fantasy book, certainly favorite high fantasy book, influenced everything. Lord of the Rings, Elric, just amazingly beautiful. I really love it. Wizard of Earthsea. Sorry. Sorry. It's YA that is Jungian allegory. I didn't read it when I was a kid, so I don't have the nostalgia factor. It fell a little flat for me. I don't care about incorporating my shadow into my shadow work or whatever. Not to be glib, but I just didn't really care. Swords and Deviltry, also C tier. Fritz Leiber. Is it? No, we'll do B tier. Really influential on a lot of stuff. Dungeons and Dragons and so on and so forth. Really dark, surprisingly dark. If you like D&D, you'll like the Fafhrd and Greymouser stories, I think. Nine Princes in Amber, I will give an A tier to make up for my seditious comments about Zelazny. Read it in one sitting. It's high fantasy with a modern twist, modern for the 1970s, and very fun. I was not like moved by it, but one of the better pieces of fantasy that I've read. Speaking of better pieces of fantasy, Black Easter by James Blish is stone cold S tier. This is a contender for favorite fantasy with King of Elfland's Daughter. I described it as a hard fantasy. It's a fantasy based on actual occult texts about the Cold War military industrial complex tapping a black magician to summon the demons of hell to destroy the world. Incredible book. Hard to get, unfortunately. Man in the High Castle, definitely A tier. If it was like more coherent, more cohesive, I think it would be S tier. I go back and forth. This might be my favorite Philip K. Dick novel. I think it's great. We all know Star of the Unborn is going to be S tier. I've talked it way beyond the point of it being talked to death. I will spare you this time. S tier. Dream Snake by Vonda McIntyre. C tier. Interesting science fantasy, but nothing really that novel or interesting happened in it. Will of the Wisp. Definitely novel, interesting things happened, but Thomas Burnett Swan has this puerile streak, this adolescent streak that kind of detracts from his fantasy. Swan allegedly may have been secretly gay, which would explain why he wrote sex between men and women so bombastically. It has this very like bags of sand feel to it. If you can find it, I would read it. It's a pretty obscure fantasy book. Burning Chrome by Gibson is S tier. Incredible. I think this is my favorite book of short stories, anthology or collection. This is a collection. If you like Neuromancer, read Burning Chrome. Just amazing stuff. Capricorn Games by Silverberg is B. The initial stories, like first three stories, are kind of annoying. They're very meta, self-referential, fourth wall breaking. And then he gets into some great world-building SF stuff when he stops bemoaning the fact that he's a science fiction writer, which is what a lot of this stuff is about. Two Towers is A tier. I was pleasantly surprised to really like this book. I really did not like Fellowship of the Ring. It took me literally it took me 35 years to finally finish it because I found it so incredibly dull. Two Towers is much better. I am actually looking forward to reading Return of the King, and Two Towers changed my opinion about the Lord of the Rings books. Book? No, book was correct. It was one book. Best of Robert Bloch. D tier, although there's one story about a kid finding a shaman in the African bush and going on a vision quest that's incredible. The rest of it is very whatever. Heliconia Spring by Aldous, B tier. Really long, really dense, sort of confusing, but great. I want to call it space opera, but it's not. It's like historical fantasy that is science fiction and set on an alien planet, and there's great aliens in it. It's just kind of long, and it's book one of three. I haven't read the others. The Invincible by Lem. We'll do A tier, yeah. It lives in the shadow of Solaris. It was written, I think, right after Solaris. Treats with the same themes, and it's not as good. But there's some interesting commentary and character dynamics about leadership in it that I think are great. Rendezvous with Rama, C tier. It is dull. It is boring. 2001 B tier. It's my favorite of these old hard SF classics, and haven't watched the movie since I was a kid. It's good. Clark wrote better. Clark wrote more gooder than the other two of the big three. Heinlein, Go Away. I, Robot by Asimov. C tier, sure. I don't agree with the general consensus opinion that Asimov was just always a bad writer or couldn't write characters or his stuff was boring. I really like Foundation. I like another book that's coming up next. I, Robot is clunky and dull and it's all thought experiments, or mostly thought experiments. It gets into some world building at the end that I thought sort of redeemed it, but I wasn't as smitten with it. Gods Themselves is B tier. The first of the three parts, I think, is Asimov at his absolute best. It's really funny, really satirical. It's about science and the power dynamics of being a professional scientist. And then part two, I thought, was amazing world building and alien biology. I compared it at the time to Silverberg. I think that does rate. Last third is homage to this, so whatever. Other Days, Other Eyes, A tier. All the crime stuff, not that interesting, but the connecting chapters of short stories set in this universe are amazing, gorgeous. The initial story is, I think, contender for best short story I've ever read. Great book. Octavia Butler, Dawn, definitely A tier. Would be S tier if the prose was a little bit more florid. I've both praised and criticized Butler's prose style for being really simple and straightforward, and I like a little sparkle. Dawn's amazing though, very creepy, disturbing book. Einstein Intersection, B tier. Delaney is a tough go. I think will be a tough go for a lot of readers. It's a book about mythology, among other things. A book about gender. It's good, but it's a discombobulating experience, as most Delaney books are. Pastel City by M. John Harrison. The first Viraconium book, science fantasy. I thought it would be weirder. It was decent. I don't think it's representative of M. John Harrison's general thing. Final Circle of Paradise by the Strugatsky brothers, definite A tier. It's a left-wing dystopian book about the perils of individualism. It's also crime fiction and pretty confusing at points. I think it's great. Other Days, Other Eyes by D.G. Compton, amazing. Colony on Mars, Penal Colony on Mars. Everybody's sad. Terrible things happen. Great. Superb. Can You Feel Anything When I Do This by Sheckley, D tier. I love the cover, I love the title. It's really dated science fiction humor, and the stories are weird, kind of like bad weird, like they don't really work that well, and whatever. I found this forgettable. Sparrow, F tier, one of the most obnoxious writing styles of any of these books. Very quippy, very sitcom-y dialogue. Last Castle by Vance, A tier. Little novella, reminds me of Dying Earth stuff. It's about an aristocracy besieged by their alien slaves. Like it a lot. Disaster Area by Ballard, A tier. The first Ballard short story collection that I've read. Familiar Ballard territory. The first story is the one that I remember most clearly, about a guy manning a military outpost after this agricultural incident creates enormous birds the size of small airplanes. Good stuff. Deloriad by Missouri Williams, C tier. It's a really hyper bleak post-apocalyptic story about a family that all live together on a compound outside of a city in the Czech Republic. I think it's supposed to be Prague. Super, super, super bleak, dark. The writing style doesn't always work. Sometimes it does. Night Flyers, F tier, super ass boring. I barely remember anything. It's not that it's like badly written, it's just so generic and so boring. I remember close to nothing about it. River of Gods, D tier. It starts promisingly. Cyberpunk set in India. If you can fill in the aesthetic details there in your mind, you've pretty much read River of Gods. It is way too long and hypersexualized in a very like 14-year-old way. Got on my nerves. Ice by Anna Kavan, absolute S tier. City in the Stars is B tier. Arthur C. Clarke's Dying Earth story about the last human colony being this self-regulating massive city ruled by AI. Great scene setting and ambiance. It's a little boring. It's Arthur C. Clarke. It's a little bit boring. Decay of the Angel, I have to pass because it's the last book in a tetralogy called The Sea of Fertility by Yukio Mishima. Amazing book, but I read it without having read the other books, so I feel not totally qualified to render an opinion about it. But Mishima is incredible. Beyond Apollo by Barry Malzberg, S tier. Malzberg, I think, at this point is probably my favorite author in science fiction. This is his most famous book. Frankenstein Unbound by Brian Aldiss. I didn't really get the point, I guess. It was kind of a rehashing of the themes of the original Frankenstein without adding a whole lot, and it felt like fan fiction to me. B tier. Ubik by Philip K. Dick. A tier. Fun, mind-bendy, reads like an action movie. They were going to turn it into an action movie, and it's just been trapped in production hell forever, I think. Goat Without Horns by Thomas Burnett Swan. D tier. It's not as good as this one, same author. It is even weirder and more ham-fisted and bizarre, to the point where it was enjoyable, but not competently written. Village of the Damned is synonymous with The Midwich Cuckoos. I am giving an A tier. It's my favorite Wyndham. Takes big, bold philosophical positions at the end and develops those themes subtly over the course of the story that does get a little bit slow, but I think this is Wyndham at his smartest and most mature, and I really approve of it. Bad Brains by Kathy Koja, another absolute stone cold stunner. Favorite horror book. I gave this a perfect 10. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I have not read The Cipher, which preceded that one immediately, but I do intend to. God's Demon by Wayne Barlow. Yeah, I'll give it a B tier. It's a high fantasy set in hell. And all the biology of hell, the ecology of hell, he writes hell as if it were an alien planet and an SF novel, is great. There's some stuff in there that's totally gross and pretty scary. The character work is a little bit cardboard, but great book. Favorite artist, science fiction, fantasy artist ever. Huge fan of Wayne Barlow. The Chrysalids by Wyndham, B tier. Read too much like YA to me. Another book telling me that religious orthodoxy is bad. Virtual Unrealities by Bester is B. That is a short story collection from the author of Stars My Destination and Demolished Man. The stories get a little samey, but it's Bester, so the writing is really strong, and there are some really high points. Universe 5 is another short story anthology. Some great stuff in there. There's a Le Guin story about Schrodinger's cat, George Alec Effinger story about a far, dying Earth future, and there's an Edgar Pangborn story set in the Davy universe that's completely beautiful. A lot of it is forgettable, as happens with these. 17 by Infinity, I'm going to put in D tier. It's another short story anthology that's a lot more dated. There's not that much in here that's all that innovative in the way that some of this stuff is, but it does contain The Machine Stops by Ian Forster, which is, I think, the best dystopian material that I've read in science fiction. It foreruns all the famous ones by at least a decade. It was written in 1909, and when you read it, it's just astonishing that it was written in 1909. I think might be the best science fiction novella that I've ever read. Incredible. You can find it online for free. It's public domain. The Doomsters by Ross MacDonald, I will give an A. I don't read really any crime fiction at all. All the crime stuff in it, I don't really care. The whodunit stuff, I still don't care. I cannot bring myself to care. But all the characterization and the prose and the scene setting and stuff, it's great. It's like a crime novel set in a Steinbeck world. On the Beach by Neville Shute, C tier. It's pretty dated, pretty boring, pretty slow. The premise is poignant, but I didn't really get on with it that well. We Who Are About To, no surprise, is S tier. Just on its own merits, it's an amazing science fiction novel. It's also kind of an anti-SF novel. It's a critique of a lot of science fictional tropes, and some pretty wild content in there, both stylistically and politically. I love it. Babel 17 by Delaney, also B tier. It's a bizarro space opera about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in linguistics that says that the things that you can name are the things that you can know, essentially, that your language prefigures your consciousness of the world and orders your sense experience. It's got the Delaney color, all the like fireworks and weirdo stuff. It does get confusing because it's Delaney. Doomed City by Boris and Arkady Strugatsky is definite S tier. I thought pretty long and hard about including this in that top 15 video, but I didn't want, duplicate authors. That rule might be stupid. If I weren't following that rule, it would be in the top 15. Another favorite dystopian book that I think is underrated. Voyage of the Space Beagle by A.E. Van Vogt. C tier, there's some great stuff in there. The story that inspired Alien is pretty amazing. It's a fix-up of serialized short stories that was really influential on stuff like Alien and like Star Trek. I was not that excited to read it. Dune Messiah, C tier. It was fine. It was too operatic, and the dialogue was pretty god-awful in parts, and it felt rushed, and it didn't live up to Dune in my mind. There was a bunch of new age stuff shoehorned in there. It's okay. It's okay. I don't agree with the consensus thing that you have to read both Dune and Dune Messiah as one book. No, you don't. Do Androids Dream is S tier. It's as good as people say it is, as good as I hoped it would be, maybe even better. The Mercerism stuff, I think, detracts from it just a little bit. People definitely disagree with me about that. Kindred by Butler, definite A tier, gut-wrenching. Same as with Dawn. If it were more authorial, if it was less straightforward in the writing style, it would be S tier. Heartbreaking stuff in there. Then we have 3BP. It's one of the biggest disappointments of this whole list. I'm not reading the other two books. I dislike this to the point where 100% of you could exhort me to read the following two books. I still wouldn't because I dislike Three Body Problem so much. Electric Forest by Tanith Lee. Yeah, S tier. Tanith Lee might be among the very most underrated science fiction fantasy writers that I've come across. Amazing stuff. If you like PKD, read this one. Book of Skulls by Silverberg. A tier. Genre bender, ambiguous story about four guys in college seeking immortality. Gets into some rough thematic territory. It's not my favorite Silverberg, clearly. There's another one up here higher on the list right here. I think it's very good. Word for World Forest by Le Guin, definite B tier. It's a pissed off Le Guin, which is interesting because she's usually so measured and stately. This is her in the trenches in the Blood and Guts anti-colonialist book that is a lot like Avatar. I think people have accused James Cameron of plagiarizing this premise for Avatar. Great book. Star Maker by Stapleton. I will give a C. It is deathly boring to read. but this is the source of a lot of stuff that followed it. Hot House by Brian Aldiss takes a chunk, I think a 2-paragraph chunk of one of these chapters, and expands it into a full-length novel. It is 100% pure, just world building and thought experiment with essentially zero plot. Parts of it are really beautiful. Parts of it are just incredibly dull. Drowned World by Ballard. It's like Crystal World in that it is amazingly well written and memorable and just drags ass for a big chunk of it. The Sluts by Dennis Cooper. Probably the most disturbing book I've ever read, but I read it in one sitting. It's a book about the internet and how truth is communicated and not preserved on the internet, and has extreme content in it. I don't think I'll read another book that is crazier than that one. Mixed feelings about it, but overall I think it's a truly amazing piece of fiction. Who Goes There by Joseph Campbell, definite B tier. This is the source material for The Thing. If you like The Thing, the John Carpenter version, read Who Goes There. Negative Space by B.R. Yeager, I'm also going to take a pass on because of stuff that happened in my own life that made the reading experience of this too confusing, I guess, or I felt I couldn't be objective about the book, so I'm just skipping it. Haunting on Hill House by Shirley Jackson, definite A tier. A horror book that wound up doing something very different than what I expected. I thought it was just a straightforward haunted house story. It is not. I know that this is a super famous book. Even so, I think a little bit underrated, or like underhyped. I think people should be more excited about this. Rourke by Avram Davidson, C tier. Sort of run-of-the-mill, not all that groundbreaking. Kind of a little bit like Downward to the Earth. Some interesting alien stuff, some kind of wry satire, but ultimately kind of forgettable. The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson. We give an A. Part of it is amazingly boring and redundant and turns a lot of people off. The archaic writing style turns a lot of people off. In terms of pure exuberance of world building and prescience of world building for a book that was written in 1912, unreal. I don't want to say too much about it other than if you're into like dark fantasy or stuff like Doom, go read this book, also in public domain. You can get it for free. House on the Borderland by Hodgson, I'm going to give a B. A lot of people, I would say most people, think that this is better than this. Same author, established a lot of horror tropes. Also, I think, might have had an influence on this, which came afterwards. Hodgson wasn't a great writer, but he was great at creating imagery that is really evocative and weird, and that's the story here. Knight's Master by Tanith Lee is a mixture of mythology and high fantasy. It's like a fantasy version of The 1001 Nights meets Jack Vance. Great. Another favorite fantasy book. The Gamesman by Barry Malzberg is an A. It's a Kafka-esque dystopian book about people getting lost in this game that may or may not be a rigged mechanism of social control. Overlay by Barry Malzberg, same author, is, however, definitely S tier. I debated putting this in the top 15. I didn't. I now question if I should have. It's about horse betters and an alien consciousness that comes to Earth and manipulates them into attempting to destroy the planet. One on Me by Tim Huntley is Tim Huntley's only book. I'm going to give it a B. It is demoted from A tier because of some subject matter that he decided to throw in there that is Swannian, Thomas Burnett Swannian. It's a surprisingly funny piece of science fiction comedy, which is really high praise for me. I am an impossible sell on comedy, anything, much less written comedy. Pretty funny, dystopian book. Overlords of War by Gerard Klein, B tier. It's a hard science fiction time travel space opera. If you just like straight down the middle sci-fi space opera stuff, I think that it's above average in that category. Vor by James Blish. a not that talked about James Blish book about first contact that is Blish, so it's good. There's only one Blish book that I've read that I didn't think was that good. We're getting to it. But Vor is great. It's really reminiscent of Hemingway. What Strange Stars and Skies by Davidson is super standard short story stuff. Apparently completely forgettable. I remember nothing about it. If you're into like the pulp magazine stories, then you'll like it, I guess. Instrumentality of Mankind by Cordwainer Smith. We are moving up in this world to S tier. I like this more than Australia. This is Smith at his absolute best. Sometimes he does step on rake heads. There's bits in here that do not age well at all. But overall, this is Smith flexing his muscles as one of the best prose stylists in all of science fiction, and someone who was clearly really passionately engaged in his work. Grey Prince by Jack Vance is D. This is Jack Vance being a smug prick and writing a defense of might makes right politics and a critique of liberalism, which a bunch of these other books are, but is just so self-satisfied and unconvincing in its arguments. I really hated it. But it's Jack Vance, so it's well written. Titan's Daughter by James Blish, I will give a D as well. It is super forgettable, hard SF that reads like X-Men. I think it was probably an influence on the X-Men. It just washed right over me. And finally, Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. I will give a B. I just did a video about this. This includes Earth of the New Sun, which I know is its own book, but people argue it's not, whatever. It is an amazing feat. It doesn't really work for me. It left me behind at a bunch of points on purpose, and that annoyed me. It's a pastiche of a number of influences that I do really love. The sum total is not my favorite thing. It's not bad, but it's not like mind-blowingly good. I'm not in love with it in the way that some people are. About half of these have full-length, detailed reviews on my Patreon. It's $5. Most of these reviews are like 15-ish minutes long, 10 to 20 minutes typically. And if you want my full thoughts on any of these, they're either there or on the YouTube channel or both. The 100-book challenge took me a lot longer than I thought it would. I do think it was worth it. I'm glad that I did it, and all of these, I would say, you can benefit from my work of reading a lot of more middling stuff and just target in on these. I would say, if you're going to do a 100-book challenge, to be precise and deliberate in what you read, but a number of these were just complete accident. Like, I rolled this randomly. I told you I wasn't going to talk about it, but I guess I am. Same with this. This, I think, was a random roll. And I had like an app on my phone that would just randomly pick from a database of titles that I had on hand. This, I happened to find at a used bookstore in Puerto Vallarta. I found this at a used bookstore and this at a used bookstore in Mexico City. This, I happened to get in a book haul that I ordered online. Same here. This was, I think, in a lot of books that I bought. So a bunch of happy accidents here. So I don't know what the answer is. I think that this is maybe is the way to go, is just to read a big range of stuff and see where your tastes lie and then go from there. I'm not done reading science fiction and fantasy, probably never will be. And I've moved on to a little bit of lit fic, and I've read a couple of memoirs. And I think I've read 9, I'm on book number 10 since these books. All right, thanks for watching. Cheers.